17th of September 1894. For the last 2 months, the over 2-century-old Qing dynasty and the new Empire of Japan, founded only 26 years earlier, have been engaged in a full-scale war against each other. After battling over the Korean peninsula, where the Chinese forces were routed, the Qing dynasty's modernized navy, the Beiyang Fleet, and the Imperial Japanese Navy's combined fleet, facing each other, are ready to fight for control over the Yellow Sea. The Beiyang Fleet was technologically superior to its opponent, the combined fleet, counting armoured cruisers and 2 imposing ironclads. Observers were confident that the Japanese would this time be defeated. However, it would soon become clear that the Chinese crew had not received adequate training in firing. Furthermore, the staggering corruption of the late Qing dynasty had crippled the quality and quantity of ammunition of the fleet. Taking the initiative once again, the Japanese admiral Ito Suikeyuki dispatched a squadron of the combined fleet to flank the enemy. Well trained, the Japanese crews strategically waited to be in an adequate range before firing, contrarily to the Qing fleet that wasted ammunition by firing much too early. Qing Admiral Ding Ruchang had formed his fleet in 2 wings, with 1 ironclad each. The Beiyang Fleet, however, soon found itself facing the bulk of the Japanese combined fleet and flanked by the dispatched squadron. A while into the battle, a couple of Chinese cruisers were sunk and many other Chinese warships withdrew. To their disbelief, the Qing turned out unable to sink any of their opponent's swift and rapidly firing vessels. They, however, heavily damaged several cruisers of the combined fleet. The Japanese flagship Matsushima itself was so damaged that Admiral Ito Suikeyuki had to transfer command onto another vessel. After a few more hours of fighting, most of the Beiyang fleet had been sunk or had escaped. Its 2 ironclads, the Zhenyuan and Dingyuan, encircled by 5 Japanese ships, desperately held on thanks to their heavy armour, although their crews had suffered heavy casualties. As if events could not get any worse, they both eventually ran out of ammunition. The ordeal for the Qing came to an end as the evening set. Admiral Ito Suikeyuki ordered to disengage and withdraw for the night, and what remained of the Beiyang fleet escaped, practically annihilated. During the battle, Admiral Ding Ruchang himself was heavily injured and had to pass command to his deputy admiral, Liu Buchan. In addition to the wounded, many sailors and officers perished. Qing captain Deng Shichang, whose cruiser Zhiyuan was sunk by the Japanese, drowned alongside his pet dog Taiyang. Another notable casualty of the battle was Philo McGiffin, an American officer advising Ding Ruchang aboard the ironclad Zhenyuan. He suffered extremely severe wounds from shrapnel and rapidly returned to the United States after the battle. McGiffin would reportedly remain in constant pain and develop what is today called PTSD. He would eventually commit suicide 2 years later. The Battle of Yalu River was a turning point in the war. China's asset in the conflict, the modern Beiyang Fleet, had been destroyed, and morale on the Qing dynasty's side had collapsed. Japan, on the other hand, heavily exploited this great victory for propaganda. As the small remnants of the Qing navy withdrew for heavy repairs in Lüshunkou harbour, Japan gained control on most of the Yellow Sea and could turn its attention back to land battles. Now, the Qing had finished establishing defences at Jiulianchang along the Yalu River. Appalled by General Ye Zhechao military management so far, Qing official Li Hongzhang, in charge of directing the war, replaced him with 74-year-old General Song Qing from Lüshunkou. Heavily experienced in domestic conflicts, Song Qing was a veteran of the Taiping, Nian and Dungan rebellions. The Qing forces had erected forts in the area, expecting the Japanese would eventually attack. Their morale was, however, very low. During the last days, Japanese war plans for Manchuria had been completed, and the Imperial Japanese Army Command decided it was finally time to push into Qing territory. To cross the Yalu River, a group of Japanese soldiers discreetly built a pontoon bridge during the night of the 24th of October and successfully entered Manchuria while avoiding detection. They then attacked the surprised Qing forces, and after a couple of hours of fighting, the chaotic Qing defense was defeated and routed, losing about 2,000 men. In yet another significant victory, the Japanese had entered enemy territory suffering only tiny losses, and soon occupied the nearby towns. Splitting their forces into two, the Imperial Japanese Army sent a division to the north and west to capture more territory and threaten Manchuria's capital, Shenyang or Mukden, and the division south to the strategic Liaodong Peninsula, aiming to secure it. On the way, only sporadic fighting occurred as the Qing forces were completely demoralized and retreating. By November 1894, the Liaodong Peninsula was practically cut off from the rest of Manchuria. On the southern tip of the peninsula, two successful amphibious operations further allowed Jinzhou and Dalian to fall to the Japanese, with little to no resistance. The next objective of the Empire of the Rising Sun, the harbour of Lüshunkou and its modern shipyard, where the remnants of the Beiyang Fleet had withdrawn for repairs, were now isolated. In order to avoid another confrontation with the combined fleets, Viceroy Li Hongzhang ordered Admiral Ding Zhuchang to evacuate his fleet and relocate to another modern naval base, Weihaiwei. Only Qing land forces, counting about 14,000 men led by different generals, would defend Lüshunkou. This city was however different from the other Manchurian towns. It was surrounded by heavily defended hills, packed with heavy artillery, and protected by strong fortifications. The Chinese were aiming to make their stand here, confident that they could repel the Japanese. Fighting began on the 20th of November 1894 as the Imperial Japanese Army attacked, supported by the combined fleet. Morale rapidly broke down on the defenders' side, and many high-ranking Qing officers secretly evacuated the area on small boats. The battle went on during the whole night, and by noon of the next day, the majority of Lüshunkou's surrounding fortifications had been captured by the Japanese. The dragon flag was however still flying atop the city. Fighting continued throughout the following day and night, during which the overwhelmed Qing forces gradually escaped or abandoned their weapons and uniforms and tried to blend in with the civilian population. The Battle of Lüshunkou was over. Initially, the clueless Qing authorities denied the city had been lost at all. As the Japanese triumphantly entered it soon after, capturing large amounts of supplies and artillery, they were fired upon by scattered and hidden Qing soldiers in the city. Consequently, the Japanese commanding officers ordered an inspection of every house, trying to find and execute the hidden Qing soldiers. Any civilian resistance was brutally suppressed. Western journalists widely covered the events that followed the battle, some claiming the Japanese slaughtered thousands of Chinese civilians in Lüshunkou, known at the West as Port Arthur, while others denied the claim. In any case, news of a large-scale massacre soon reached the West and greatly degraded the image of Japan internationally. The Japanese foreign minister denied that a massacre had taken place, and instead claimed that all the executed men were in fact Chinese soldiers dressed in civilian clothes. Nonetheless, estimates of the massacre ranged from 1 to 60,000 deaths. The fall of Lüshunkou meant that the northern coast of the Gulf of Bohai Sea was no longer protected. The Qing dynasty had also lost its only dry docks capable of completely repairing modern ships. Eventually accepting the fact that Lüshunkou was lost, the Qing imperial court was outraged and disgraced and demoted most of the local officers and generals. Viceroy Li Hongzhang was also stripped of all his titles and honours, despite having dedicated his life to the dynasty's cause. In December, a final battle would take place for the year 1894 at present-day Gaizhou. The city was easily captured by Japan, further chipping away into Manchuria. In less than half a year, Japan had effectively taken control of Korea, practically annihilated the Qing dynasty's Beiyang Fleet, and secured the Liaodong Peninsula. Virtually, the Japanese had probably already won the conflict, but the Qing authorities were still convinced they could take back control and win the war. Fighting would subsequently continue. The Japanese now planned to capture Weihaiwei in order to finish off the Beiyang Fleet and deprive China of its other great harbour and last defence guiding the Gulf of Bohai. As the Beiyang Fleet, evacuating from Lüshunkou, relocated into the harbour of Weihaiwei, the ironclad Zhongyuan struck a reef and a large hole was torn in its hull. Damage was too significant to be repaired, and the ship was incapacitated. Her captain, Lin Taizang, out of shame or fearing punishment, decided to commit suicide by swallowing opium the next day. Having lost one of its two best warships, the Qing Navy's morale shattered. The garrisons in and around Weihaiwei were not more confident. By late January 1895, it was time for the Empire of Japan to resume its operations. Both the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army were ready for the campaign on Weihaiwei. Warships from the combined fleet bombarded settlements to the west of the city as a distraction, while Imperial Japanese Army troops landed to the east. The strategy to secure the city was the following. Before moving in, the invading troops had first captured the surrounding fortifications through a three-pronged attack during the Chinese New Year celebrations, making sure that Qing forces would be unprepared. The success of the careful planning was however crippled by the weather, as when the Japanese assaulted the fortification, a freezing blizzard broke out. On top of this, several ships of the Beiyang Fleet fired upon the invading force. To the shock of his men, Major General Odera Yatsuzumi, commanding the Japanese forces, was killed by shrapnel from the ships. He would be the highest-ranking casualty of the war on the Japanese side. Despite the conditions, the Japanese prevailed. On the night of the 1st of February, the Qing Weihaiwei garrison's morale crumbled and they fled, allowing the Japanese Imperial Army to occupy the city the next day. However, the remnants of the Beiyang Fleet, stationed inside Weihaiwei harbour, behind a barrier of mines and chains to prevent the combined fleet from approaching, were still proudly flying the dragon flag. Each night, they were harassed by Japanese torpedo boats in raid attacks. Blockaded on sea and surrounded on land, Admiral Ding Ruchang's situation was hopeless. On the other side, Admiral Ito Sukeyuki, commanding the Japanese combined fleet, wrote a letter to him as his old friend. He expressed his regrets about the current situation and humbly asked Ding Ruchang to capitulate. The Japanese admiral further asked him to come to Japan under his protection, where he would be granted political asylum, adding he would also help him reorganize the Qing fleet after the war. Ding Ruchang was reportedly moved and read the letter several times. With a heavy heart, he answered that although he was grateful for Sukeyuki's friendship, he could not abandon his duties to the Qing Empire as Admiral of the Beiyang Fleet. The Chinese admiral finished with, "The only thing now remaining for me to do is to die." On the 12th of February, Ding Ruchang took an overdose of opium to commit suicide. His second in command, Admiral Liu Buchan, ordered to blow up his own ship, the Dingyuan, remaining ironclad of the Beiyang Fleet, so that it would not fall in the hands of the Japanese. Following his late commanding officer's example, Liu Buchan took his own life the following day. Shortly after, the few remaining Chinese ships surrendered to the Japanese. The Beiyang Fleet was no more. On the 12th of February 1895, Weihaiwei had been conquered. The Gulf of Bohai was no longer guarded, and the imperial domain was now exposed. Slowly, Qing authorities reluctantly began negotiating peace with the Japanese, as morale further broke down in the Chinese ranks. Qing forces in Manchuria gradually fell apart due to desertion, and the only 4 attempts to recapture lost territory were all unsuccessful. As the harsh winter climate eased, Japan could resume its operations in Manchuria. Imperial Japanese Army forces assaulted Niuzhuang, modern-day Yingkou, in March. After a short fight, the demoralized Qing forces retreated inside the city, and the battle turned into urban warfare as the Japanese followed. Once again, the Qing forces were routed, and over 600 Chinese soldiers and large amount of supplies and ammunition were captured by the Japanese. Meanwhile, the Japanese government refused to receive Qing ambassadors for peace negotiations, requesting that Li Hongzhang, who had been disgraced by the imperial court, should lead the delegation. Putting additional pressure on the Qing dynasty, the Japanese invaded the Pescadores Islands off Taiwan. Consequently, The Qing reluctantly restored Li Hongzhang to some of his titles, and he was sent to the city of Shimonoseki for peace talks. Japanese nationalism would however lead to an embarrassing scandal for the Empire of the Rising Sun. On the 24th of March, as Li Hongzhang was returning to his lodgings from talks, a young Japanese nationalist emerged from the crowd and shot him in the face. Li Hongzhang was only lightly wounded, but the shameful event forced the Japanese to grant a 30-day-long ceasefire. As the Qing official was treated in a Japanese hospital, he asked his nephew and adoptive son, Li Jingfang, part of the delegation, to replace him in the talks. The Treaty of Shimonoseki, officially putting an end to the First Sino-Japanese War, was finally agreed upon and signed on the 17th of April 1895.
Li Hongzhang and Li Jingfang signed on behalf of Qing Emperor Guangxu and Ito Hirobumi and Mutsu Munemitsu on that of Japanese Emperor Meiji. The terms of the treaty brought profound humiliation on the crumbling Qing dynasty. China was forced to open new ports to Japan and granted the same trade privileges as the United Kingdom, the United States, France and Russia. It would also have to pay colossal war reparations of 200 million taels of silver, cede sovereignty of the Pescadores Islands and of Taiwan, as well as of the Liaodong Peninsula to Japan, including all of the local fortifications, military equipment and supplies. Most importantly, to settle the initial conflict that had ignited the war in the first place, China had to relinquish all control over the Kingdom of Korea, officially granting it full autonomy and independence. However, just 5 days later, Russia and Germany, worried about the Japanese acquisition of Liaodong Peninsula, organized a triple intervention, bringing in France with them as an ally of Russia. Jumping into the debate, they persuaded Japan to relinquish Liaodong Peninsula in exchange for another 30 million taels of silver from the Qing Empire. Hostilities would not be settled everywhere though, as the Qing officials on the island of Taiwan were outraged at having to abandon the region and cede it to Japan. They officially rebelled against the Qing dynasty and declared the independence of the Republic of Formosa. For the humiliated Qing court, this was now Japan's problem. The ever-expanding empire would deal with the situation shortly after, eventually taking control of the island after a 5-month campaign. The First Sino-Japanese War was officially over. For the first time in history, the traditional millennia-old Chinese domination of East Asia had come to an end, as Japan became the new dominant power in this part of the globe. Although independent from its traditional overlords, the Kingdom of Korea, soon declaring itself Empire of Korea, would be annexed by Japan a few years later. But why did China lose every single battle on land or sea against a numerically inferior opponent? Although the Qing dynasty had modernized its land and naval military technology like the Japanese, it only minimally adapted its old strategies and tactics. The Imperial Japanese Army, on the other hand, had completely embraced Western military strategy, which proved far superior. Furthermore, crippling corruption within the Qing dynasty officials and officers had hindered the effectiveness and organization of administration. In addition, Chinese weapons and ammunition were often defective, as dedicated funds were embezzled by local officers and officials. Although the Beiyang Fleet had originally received huge resources, its funding was severely cut down by the imperial courts in the late 1880s. Sources on the subject are conflicting, but this was quite possibly due to the influence of Empress Dowager Cixi, Guangxu's aunt, who wished to build and maintain the luxurious summer palace. In any case, much needed funds for the navy were diverted, hindering its maintenance. As a result of the war and of the conduct of the Imperial Japanese Army in Manchuria, the Han Chinese civilian population developed an even stronger xenophobic attitude, and particularly anti-Japanese sentiment. The weakness of the Qing dynasty and ever-growing foreign powers' influence over China would eventually lead them to launch the Boxer Rebellion 3 years later. Thank you for watching my video, I hope you enjoyed it. If so, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions or requests, feel free to leave them in the comments section below.